I am Patrick Brady. I'm a postdoctoral associate here in the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health at the University of Minnesota. I'm a mixed methods researcher and evaluator, and I really value qualitative research and like to incorporate it in my work because a lot of the questions I ask require qualitative methods. And this sort of technique allows you to answer more efficiently certain qualitative questions in a really efficient and effective way. Grace, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I am Grace Ryan. I am an assistant professor at University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School in our Department of Population and Quantitative Health Sciences. And like Patrick, I do a lot of mixed methods research, but I really feel like my home in research is qualitative work. And I have been using rapid methods. And I'll give some examples of this as we talk over the next hour and a half, but I started using them doing pandemic response and vaccine promotion, and have now sort of incorporated them into my regular routine, and I'm working right now specifically on expanding rapid methods to make them more accessible for community engaged researchers and for community-led research projects. And I'm really excited to share more about that with you.
So, can everybody see my slides? Does it look nice?
It looks great.
So before we get started, we do have just some logistics. If you have questions during our presentation, please put it in the chat. One advantage of co-presenting is one of us can be in that chat responding to you, or letting the person who's actively presenting know to take a moment and look at the chat and respond to that question. We also have built in time for questions throughout this presentation. So if something's not really immediately needing to be discussed, you can put it in the chat. Someone will answer it, but we might not stop to answer it at that time because we will have those opportunities. To give you an outline of what we're going to talk about, we're going to give a really brief intro to rapid qualitative assessment, some considerations for using these methods, and then we're going to go into the specific technique that we're going to describe today. We're going to go really in depth through the steps you need to do in order to complete a template analysis. Hopefully this will prepare you to go out in your own work and use this method. We're also going to give examples and some lessons learned from our own research. We're going to wrap up with an exercise. We're hoping we have a fair amount of time to go through this and actually have you template some real data from one of my research projects, just to get that experience in kind of a more controlled environment. After we do that, hopefully we'll have time to spend some time reflecting as a group and wrapping up. So the poll at the beginning asked you, are you familiar with template analysis? But I think really important to all rapid methods is how familiar are you with qualitative research? And much more of you were familiar based on this poll we sent out before. So some of the things we talk about are going to be kind of repeated. You probably have already heard them just from engaging in normal, traditional qualitative techniques. But then there's also other considerations you need to think about when you move into these more rapid methods. But I was very happy that we didn't get anybody who was not at all familiar. As a qualitative fan, just always love to see that. So what are rapid assessment, or what is rapid qualitative assessment? So I really like this definition. It has a lot of important parts. First, that they're intensive and team-based. So these aren't just something you can do on the fly. It takes a lot of planning. You need a team who's trained. They use triangulation, iterative data analysis, and additional data collections. So as things evolve, you might have to collect additional data or think about accessing other data sources to get a better, more complete understanding. But really importantly, the goal is to quickly develop a preliminary understanding of a situation from the insider's perspective. And that's really the strength of all rapid qualitative methods, is getting that preliminary understanding of a situation. And really, multiple approaches and methods fall under this umbrella. And this is a relatively recent kind of field. So new techniques are being experimented with and developed, and people are figuring out what really works in different contexts. Oftentimes, people talk about this as an alternate to traditional qualitative methods. I more often think of it as a supplement, or, sometimes it is just the better technique. But really importantly, you can use both rapid and traditional methods in the same project. It's all about using the right technique for answering the right questions. In terms of why you might choose to use rapid methods over traditional techniques, a lot of times in research, the goal is simply not in-depth analysis. The questions you're asking don't require that really deep, nuanced understanding. I think this is even more true in things like evaluation, where sometimes you just need to know what has happened, how were things implemented, what went wrong and what went right. For those sorts of questions, these methods are extremely valuable. And again, it doesn't preclude doing traditional analysis later. As long as you have the data collected, you can get that preliminary understanding and then move towards a more nuanced analysis later. The other thing I really love about these techniques are they are action-oriented. The overarching goal of using these methods is to get that rich qualitative data, but translate it into actionable results. So you're impacting practice, or you're influencing the next step of your research. And this could be for a lot of reasons. Maybe you just have a project where you really need to learn something fast. You need to progress, or there's time-sensitive issues. I think these methods got a lot of attention during the pandemic because we needed to get that understanding fast. We had to know what was going on and turn it into, really community-based and, systems-based strategies that influence how we were doing things on the ground. So I do want to kind of, before you even think about the specific technique or the specific method, there are some early considerations you should think about while planning your analysis. And a lot of these things are specific to rapid qualitative analysis. Some of them also are just the general research process that we wanted to highlight because it might be more important if you're a newer researcher to qualitative research or using rapid methods. So the first thing you should ask is just, are rapid methods appropriate for your project? There's a lot of benefits. So these methods can save you a lot of time and also minimize your cost, both because you're saving time, so your labor costs can go down, but also you don't need things like expensive qualitative software packages to facilitate your analysis. It can improve the efficiency of your analysis team. So again, allows you to get those results out the door and influence what's going on in the community. And there has been research that shows that these techniques produce similar results to more traditional methods. I will mention that this is only when the question is appropriate for these methods that's the case. Because there are certain techniques where they just don't line up and you're going to get different results. These techniques are also really good for teams with varying levels of qualitative research experience, and it's a great intro to qualitative research. They're a little more easy to grasp and understand, as I think you'll see when we get into the steps, but you're still working with that rich qualitative data that I think a lot of us really value. These techniques are really best conducted by teams who are familiar with the topic being studied. There's a lot of choices and judgment calls and interpretation you have to make as kind of the data reduction tool. And if you're familiar with the topic, it's a lot easier to understand what people are saying. So having really familiar or experience with what you're studying can facilitate being able to use these methods. It's also a really good way to promote health equity. And that's for a couple of different reasons. The first is kind of related to these past 2 points. Because it's better for individuals with varying levels of qualitative research, you can bring in community members to your research team and really facilitate that analysis from the insider perspective. So you're not, as a researcher, doing all the interpretation, your community partners are. And also the community partners might actually be the best people to do the analysis, because again, it's best when it's conducted by teams who are familiar with the topic. The second reason it can promote health equity is, again, just because it really leads itself to translating to action, whether that's more research or, actually making changes in practice. So if your research question is around health equity, these methods really facilitate change. There are limitations and pitfalls of using these techniques. We don't want people thinking that, we can just go out, do an interview, and use these techniques, and that's all we have to think about. All the standards for qualitative research still apply. So you need to be doing it ethically and have importance and clarity to the questions you're asking. Your methods need to match the research question, the populations. All these things need to be considered. These methods are rapid, but they're still rigorous. And you need to be thinking about the credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability of your results. All these things still apply. And these techniques really aren't suited for certain questions. So if you're doing a study where the goal is to generate theory about a topic, or you're working with really unstructured data, these techniques won't work very well. Also, some types of analysis really rely on having that nuanced understanding of what is being said in the context, things like discourse analysis. So when you abstract those things using rapid techniques, you lose the goal of using those techniques. So you want it to be matched to your research question. I'm going to probably say that multiple times in the next couple of slides because I think it's so important. These next 2 points, I think you can address if you really plan everything from the beginning and have a good idea of what's going on. But, one reason you might choose these is because they are rapid. We're going to get those results. But if things like recruitment, if you're having challenges getting the data in, these techniques aren't going to facilitate you getting results out the door, at least not meaningful results. So when you're building your research team, it's really important to have embedded researchers or community members that can facilitate recruitment and also data collection because they're trusted and they have those existing relationships. You can also be really slowed down by having to return back to the raw data, whether that is a recording or a transcript or your notes. If you're seeing that people on your research team just aren't providing complete summaries or complete analysis. For example, if you really wanted to include quotations when you're producing your kind of deliverable, but you didn't include it in your analysis, it's going to take a long time to go back and find the appropriate quotes, much more than if you just do it from the beginning. Or if you're seeing inconsistency across team members. And again, I think this can be a problem of just not putting in the time before to make sure everybody on your team is on the same page about the topic being studied, the processes you're using, and everything that's kind of going into your research before you actually start doing the data collection. And that leads to something that's kind of a maybe personal inclination or something I value quite a bit. Other people, might not think of this as much or as important, But to me, really reflecting on your position in society, your positionality, so the social, political, and cultural context you exist in prior to and while you're doing the data collection and analysis, to me, it's been a really important part of conducting research. And when I started using these techniques, I really fell back on these reflections a lot more, because during these rapid qualitative analyses, you have fewer touch points for reflection because they are happening faster. And there's more opportunities to bring in bias because you as a researcher are doing some of the abstraction and data reduction. But I think there's plenty of opportunities to embed reflections within your process, whether that's keeping reflexivity journals or just memoing throughout about all your processes, what you're seeing, or having team debriefs where you just talk about these issues. If you're interested in positionality, there's a lot of good resources online, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. Before we kind of get to the main technique, again, I just want to highlight that you really need to match your research question to the analytic technique that you will use. This is, I think, the most important question, and where I'm a little hesitant in these methods really expanding, because there's been people I've talked to that want to use these methods to answer questions about things like theory generation. And if it doesn't match, you're just not going to get good results. So really do some time thinking, is my research question matching with my analytic technique? The other thing I always think about is you as a researcher are going to have to make choices, and really considering how those choices are going to reflect your results are going to be important, again, when we're going through this more rapid process. So thinking about why you're asking the questions you're asking. Again, going back to some of those, is this important? Who is included and excluded from participating? You know, that's always an important question in research. But again, when I think we have these techniques that where the aim is to influence practice, if we're excluding important voices, their voices aren't being translated into those results and then into practice. So it's vital to make sure including all the voices that you need to. Things like who is conducting the interview can be really important to the types of responses you're going to get. So again, is it a researcher doing it, or is it a community member who has that prior relationship? And thinking about what would produce the best results is going to be vital, again, to getting the best results and, in the end, the best outcomes. So that was kind of a really high-level overview. And now we're going to move into the specific technique that we use, template analysis. And I really like to think of it as just one tool in your toolbox of rapid methods. So this technique uses a summary template to analyze transcripts or other qualitative data. So it's really simple. You'll see when we show you these summary templates that it really reduces the data analysis process. And it's really easy because you have major topics in any data collection. And in this, we're just summarizing what was heard in the data collection, the interviewers' focus groups in this template. And then we're going to look across each data collection event to see what are the major themes. And all the template is a data reduction tool that you apply to each transcript. We'll get into how you develop it, but it's really based on broad domains. So again, we're just getting that preliminary understanding. We're not getting real nuanced information. And we're really importantly, we're not just developing this from the beginning and sticking with it. Like all qualitative research, we refine it based on what we're hearing in our results. So we have our template. If we see that maybe a new domain is emerging from the data, you refine your template and then add it in and reapply it. And we'll show examples of templates and also go through all the steps. But before I hand it off to Grace, I have a step 0 that I think is still incredibly important. And it's, again, just reflecting on all the things that go into research and familiarizing yourself with your process, the questions you're asking, both the broad research questions and the specific questions that you're verbalizing, and also your data, and reflecting on why you've made the choices that you have. To me, you really need to do this to conduct a rigorous analysis, and it's, to me, the most important step. I think memoing is incredibly important throughout the research process, all the way from when you're developing your research questions to starting the analysis. Just having that record of what was done and what your thought process is really helpful, because you're not going to remember it in your head necessarily as you go back. So documenting it all, again, is just a really useful technique. So now I'll pass it off to Grace, who's going to go through the steps of conducting one of these analyses.
Thanks, Patrick. And I saw some questions in the chat, and hopefully I answered them preliminarily, but I do think that as we talk through, and my goal for talking through the process of the steps is to also share not just, a high level of what you do, but some of the sort of best practices that we've learned in using my research as an example. And I hope that will help clarify how, some appropriate research questions. I saw somebody had a question about that, and how this is more of a deductive than inductive method. So I want to first acknowledge that this is a method that was developed by Allison Hamilton. She's a researcher at the VA, I believe in Los Angeles, and she has done some great work with this. My goal is not just to sort of share, this is step 1 through 5, this is how you do it, but like I said, really to try and give some examples and share what me and my team, and I know Patrick has been doing this work too, and we sort of talk through this together, what we find to be some best practices and tips and tricks along the way. Next slide. Okay, so step 1 of this process, once you, and I'll say this process starts at where you have, probably at least written your interview or focus group guide, however you're doing your data collection, and started to do data collection. We can talk more at the end, but like other qualitative methods, rapid analysis can be done as you are collecting data. And I think in some ways that's a best practice, or once you're at the end. But these steps start really when we're starting to review transcripts or audio files, and moving from data collection into the analysis phase. So step 1, create a neutral domain that corresponds with each question. This is, I think where it might sort of be clear that this is more of a deductive method. So basically we start by taking either our interview or focus group guide, and taking each of those questions individually and creating this neutral domain. This is really, I think of this as just a brief, I would say 2 to 4 word summary of that domain. Or that question. We're going to use these domains as the way that we organize data. So this step is really important in preparation, because these domains are how you're going to recognize and summarize your data as we go through the process. This probably also highlights how this is really only appropriate for semi-structured or more structured interviews. I know some people who do qualitative work where they do not write an interview guide or a focus group guide. You sort of let the participant guide you in maybe more ethnographic methods. And that's not to say I haven't seen rapid ethnographic analysis and methods, but this is really, template summary is really great for, like I said, those semi-structured, structured data collections. So to create those neutral domains, I like to do this by having a couple team members take your data collection guide, come up with what they think those neutral domains meet to compare, And I've included some examples of how we did this from an interview that we did with clinicians around COVID-19 vaccination. And so, for example, one question we had was around, I'm interested in learning about your experience administering COVID-19 vaccines to youth and adolescents. So to get started, can you tell me a little bit about your process for COVID-19 vaccine delivery? And our domain name for this, vaccine process. Similarly, question around, have you experienced any challenges in being able to offer COVID-19 vaccines to adolescents? Our domain name was vaccine delivery challenges. So really just a very brief way to summarize that question. Some things to think about here are whether it's appropriate to have, domains and subdomains. Do you have a question that you might want to split into 2 domains? If you, are asking in a question about barriers and facilitators, for example, splitting that into 2. And this is a process that we'll return to sort of throughout, whether we need to make adjustments to these domains, but getting started thinking about some of these things can be really helpful. Another thing I'll note is, a lot of us do very theory or framework-based work. And, I know I often use an implementation framework for a lot of my, especially evaluation work. And that implementation framework has sort of construct names, and usually I'll have each question maps to one of those constructs. So if that's something that your team is familiar with and it's sort of helpful to you to organize data, then each of, you might consider using those theoretical construct names for your domain names. But again, the goal is really to take each question in your data collection guide and map each question to a domain name that you create. So we can move on to step 2. Once you've created those domain names, that's sort of the first step, and then we create the actual summary template. So this is what you're going to be using to organize each interview or focus group data into sort of this summarized format. So you really want to spend, I think, things that we emphasize in all research, right? Putting in more time in the beginning to think about how you're organizing and collating data will pay off in the end and sort of help to increase the efficiency and sort of rapidness of data collection. So I like to spend a long time thinking about how we're going to create this summary template and what kind of information we want to make sure that we're pulling out from each of the data collections that we are going to be looking at. So again, I've included my example on the left. I always do this, and sort of best practice, I think, is having the top half of this document be almost like metadata. So I always include who prepared the summary template here, who the interviewer or focus group facilitator was, what the interview date was. Some other things you might want to consider here are what the analysis date was. This is a way too to ensure, Patrick talked about some of the ways that we can still ensure that we do still ensure rigor in rapid analysis. And this is a great way to ensure dependability of your research, right? Creating that audit trail to make sure you sort of know who's touched this data at different points and keeping track of that. Some other things you want to include up at this top part beyond sort of, some things about how the analysis and data collection happened, but thinking about what is relevant that you want to capture about that data collection that's specific to your project or to your research questions. So in this example, I have up at the top the respondent or participant role. We did these interviews with both clinicians and with individuals who worked in management and administrative roles. And so we wanted to make sure we are capturing that here so that when somebody's going back to look at this template, or so that when we're comparing templates next to each other, we have those sort of quick reference points to think about what are some things that might alter our interpretation of this data, our understanding of this summary. So some other ideas you might want to think about here are, if you're doing focus group discussions, maybe the number of participants who are in that focus group. If you are collecting data in multiple languages, you might want to include the language that data was collected in, all at the top. Again, thinking about those things that are really relevant to your research questions, and then also to how you're going to want to synthesize that data across these multiple data collection points that you have. So I always include that at the top. And then the bottom half of the sort of summary template that I create, I always do this as a table. There's a couple of reasons for that. I find it a little bit of an easier way to organize data and then copy and paste it into, we'll talk about how we create a matrix as one of the final steps later. I have also seen people do this as creating it sort of like an outline almost, where each main bullet will be one of the domains, and then you'll have as sub-bullets to those domains, your sort of notes or important quotations. I'd say this is really a personal preference. Again, I like doing the table. I think it's a little bit cleaner, but you might, as you work with your team, figure out different ways to do this. So this is sort of an example of how I create the table. I have the domains as one column, and then the other column I have as notes and important quotations. And then one thing I do want to highlight here is, you have your domains, and again, those are those sort of short names that you've come up with that map to each question in your data collection guide. And then I always include an other observations domain here. I think, while this is very much a deductive method where we're trying to just summarize sort of question by question, as all of you who have done qualitative research before, which it sounds like almost all of you have been involved in some point, you know that things come up in interviews and focus groups that you were not expecting. And so you don't want to lose all of that information just because you don't have a pre-specified domain for it. For example, in all of the interviews or focus groups I do, I always end with the question of, is there anything else that you think is really relevant to this conversation we're having that we haven't gotten a chance to touch on? And often that's when the participant says something that's, really fascinating or maybe really unexpected. And so being able to include that sort of other observations domain, it helps you to make sure you capture all of that. So we can move to the next step. Sorry, Patrick, next slide.
Is it not advancing for you?
Oh, I think it just advanced too far now. I think your computer just lagged. This is it. Thank you. So once you've created that template summary, it's time to take it for a test drive to make sure of a couple things. One, to ensure sort of its usability and relevance to your project. And this is also a chance to start establishing sort of reliability between your team members and how you're filling out this template and what sort of level of data and summary you're gonna want to put in it. So the process that I always use for this is to have several, definitely two, ideally more team members test out this template that you've created using the same data. So whether that is the same interview guide, the same interview, the same focus group, you're going to take the template sort of draft that you have and one data collection and fill out this template to summarize the data, but also to assess some of these following sort of logistical questions. So this is a great point to do sort of a check-in with your team about, do the domain names make sense to everybody? Do you need to relabel any of them? Are you finding that maybe there's a question where participants, there's a natural way that you might want to split that into subdomains? Is there any additional information that you think you need to capture at the top of that template? And also, it's a good time, I think, especially when you're working with community partners, to do a check on how long it's taking everybody to summarize the data into this template. This is all going to help so that you can sort of establish all this now and move forward, with the goal of sort of being rapid and efficient. When you have to go back and change these things after you've gotten through maybe half of your data, and then you're going to have to re-summarize data because you've changed your domain names or you want to change something about the template. Doing this check-in now really helps you to make sure that that doesn't happen and to make sure that everybody is on the same page from the beginning. And again, I think this is especially important. I'm doing a project with a community group now, and we're spending a lot of time on these sort of initial steps to make sure we're all on the same page. Some of these community members are not as familiar with qualitative research, we've done this too in our own work when we're training research assistants. We spend a lot of time sort of at step 3, making sure we're prepared before we move forward. And next slide. So what goes in the template, right? This is really sort of the heart of, what this analysis technique is. You've created it, and now you need to take your transcript or your audio file and condense all of that data into this, relatively short template summary. So the goal here is really to highlight what are the major points within each domain. And remember, those domains map directly to an interview guide or focus group guide question. So basically, the template ends up being a way to sort of quickly summarize each participant's response to that question. So you want this distilled summary that answers questions. I tend to do this in bullet point format. You can do it in full sentences. Again, probably a personal preference. This is the time that you can capture good quotes. I'll highlight here a sort of pitfall that I see, especially when we're training people on this and working with people who are less familiar with qualitative research, is the tendency to, think, oh, this is, their whole response is great, I'm just going to copy and paste that into the template. And that's really not the goal. You really want this to be a very short summary of what they said, but you still want to include good quotes. I think including quotes is essential in qualitative research. And when you're sort of reporting on qualitative research, to be able to include participants' own words. So I like to think of quotes to include here as, oftentimes it's pretty easy to just summarize what somebody said in, 1 or 2 bullet points, but sometimes you'll come across somebody who, says something in a way that even if you summarized it, you think, wow, that is the perfect way to say this. That's the perfect way to make this point. And so I try and think of that as what's a quote that would, I would like to feature as, whether I'm writing a paper or giving a presentation or making an infographic, what's a quote that could really feature what this person is saying. So this, is where it gets a little sort of personal preference. And as you familiarize yourself with all of your data, you'll start to be able to pick out what are those good quotes and what are, the maybe not so good quotes. This is also a really good time to make note of any absence of data. So, if somebody just didn't have an answer to a question and there's nothing to put in that domain, don't just leave it blank, but note that. Absence of an answer is sometimes in our work, right, as important as an answer. I just did a project and we had a question at the end. It was an evaluation project. And we had a question at the end around, is there any way that we could, I think it was change something about the training that we did. And most people said, no, I can't really think of anything, or like, no, I don't have anything to say about that. And so you really want to make sure you capture that. Additionally, if an interviewer didn't ask a question, you might want to enter into that domain, corresponding domain, like not applicable or, not asked. Just make sure that you're really using this template to give a good idea of what happened in that interview. And thinking about this sort of on the whole, the ideal is that somebody who is maybe not familiar with, at least with the nuances of your project, maybe you want your research assistant to be able to sort of familiarize yourself with something, they should be able to look at this template and get a pretty good idea of what happened in that interview or data collection in a very short amount of time without having to read the transcript. A good rule of thumb is to think about a summary for an interview. And I think about this as maybe a 30 to 45 minute interview as being that template summary should be about 1 to 2 pages. If you're doing a focus group, you're probably going to have a little bit more detail in there. A 2 to 4 page summary for a focus group is probably about a 2 to 4 page summary for, a focus group that lasted maybe 45 to 60 minutes. Is probably about right. For focus groups, you might have some added points in here around, this is the summary of people's responses. This many people agreed, this many people disagreed. And so you might have a little more in there. I would say where you're going wrong is if you have maybe an 8-page transcript and a 4 to 6 page template summary document. you're probably going to want to revisit how much you're really including in that, and you know, maybe scaling back a little bit. So again, to sort of reorient you to where we are, where this is the point at which we have multiple people filling out the template, thinking about what goes in it. And then next slide, we are going to come back together to discuss that initial round of summaries. And so for those of you who've done maybe thematic analysis or other types of qualitative work, this process is probably sounding a little bit similar, right? We often do this sort of, group coding and then reconciliation of where we're at. So this really mirrors that as well. And again, is really targeted at building not only efficiency in moving forward, but also the dependability of our results and making sure that our team is really on the same page. So when I do this on our own team, I will, take those team members' initial summaries from their templates. And this is one of the reasons I like to use that sort of table format for this. I'll make a master table where I have, again, the first column is the domains, and then additional columns are, teammate 1 summaries, teammate 2 summaries. And so that we can look across those people who are summarizing to sort of see where we're at in terms of being similar. So I'll make that document. I will send it out to the team who's doing this reconciliation process. And our goal for this team meeting when we come back together is really to establish consensus and the breadth and depth of information that we want to be captured, and to have a discussion around some of those logistical considerations as well. So again, I think this part, step 3, I'm spending more time talking through it. I think this is really one of the key parts of making sure that sort of this rapid analysis is on track. One of the major issues that I've seen when working with teams of multiple levels or with people less familiar with this is figuring out how much information is enough. And there's no good way for me to say, this is how long it should be, or this is exactly, the level of detail you want. That's going to be somewhat dependent on your project and research questions. But the important thing here, I think, is to establish this, how similar the information is that you're capturing within those domains between team members. Are you having people, maybe pick up on something, and one team member is picking up on something within that interview that another one wasn't? This is your time to sort of reconcile that and think about what level of detail you want. What kind of quotes do you want? Are you all coming up with sort of the same quotes that you're including in that template? Do you have different quotes? What kind of changes do you need to make? And then also thinking about, are there changes, I said, I think in 2 previous slides, are there changes that you want to make at this point to the content or the layout of the template? Do you feel like you need to change some of those domain names? Or is there additional information you want to capture up at the top that you want to make sure you're doing? I think these are really important, again, especially when you have large amounts of data. If you're doing an interview project and you have, 20, 30, 40 interviews, it's going to be a huge pain if you have to go back and recapture information from all of those. So really making sure you sort of have that, that template itself, the way that you want it at this point is really important. And then I also want to emphasize that if you get to the end of this sort of initial discussion with your team members and you feel like, okay, I think we're closer to being on the same page, but we're maybe not quite there yet, I will often do a second round of this group summarizing process where you pick a new transcript and send it out to the team and say, okay, let's use the template again. Why don't you fill it out and let's come back together to have another round of these meetings. I think this depends a lot on the composition of your team, how familiar you are with working on these projects. I'll say we did a lot of these projects during the pandemic, and the first couple times we used rapid analysis, we were probably doing multiple rounds of these group summarizing. But the team I had has worked together for a while now, and we usually find that after one of these meetings, we're all on the same page. So again, take the time that you feel like you need with your team members to sort of get this step right. And once you've done that, you are free to sort of, divide up the rest of the transcripts across the team and summarize. We only need I say you only really need one template summary per transcript, per focus group, per interview, whatever it is. You can certainly double summarize transcripts. It's not necessarily necessary, especially if you've done step 3, like we just talked about pretty rigorously. I do have a project right now where it is community led, and they said for at least a little while they would feel most comfortable if each they're doing focus groups that they're calling community conversations. They feel they want each community conversation, the template, to be done by both a community member and by somebody on our research team. And I thought that was actually a really great way to start for this group. We're finding that both of those team members who are doing the summarizing, the community side person and the research side person, are actually doing a pretty consistent job of matching each other and what they're pulling out of in the template. But again, this is, this process is very customizable to the needs and sort of preferences of your team. Some of this choice also might depend on the number of transcripts, the number of team members, and if you have a time constraint. Again, we're using some of these rapid methods for time constraint projects, and that double summarizing will, take essentially twice as long to get done. But once you've finished all the summaries, you move to step 5, which is transferring all of the summaries into a matrix. Excuse me. And this is what you're using to really synthesize and look across your results. So I always create this master table. I've given you this example on the left-hand side from our COVID interviews again. And you now put all of the domain names across the top as individual columns, and the interviews, each individual interviewer, if you're doing focus groups, are the individual rows. I always do this in Excel just because it's an easy way to organize data. And then you can have one team member go to those template summaries and just simply copy and paste, from the corresponding domains into the corresponding box in the Excel table. My personal preference, especially if you have a lot of data, maybe you've done longer interviews and you have a lot of these domains. These interviews that we did were relatively quick. But one thing you can consider, oh, sorry, Patrick, can you go back? One thing you can consider is creating this master Excel document, but then, I'll do this on the first sheet, and then I'll create additional Excel, sheets in that Excel document where I'll take maybe just a couple of the domains together across all of the interviews and look at them, just to visually not have so much, textual data to process. You can also, something we've done in the past that's, I think, been very helpful is consider using color coding. If there's a feature of a transcript that you want to highlight. So we did focus groups in English and Spanish, and we highlighted the focus groups that were in Spanish, just so we had, again, sort of a visual cue when we were looking at this to remember, oh, this is, we were making comparisons by English and Spanish, and that allowed us to do that a little bit more easily. And so that is, steps 1 through 5 are sort of the traditional, this is how you do template analysis, start to finish. And then I also like to include, when I do this presentation, a step 6, which is sort of synthesis. This is, for those of you who do qualitative research regularly, you probably have your own ways of doing this. For qualitative projects, whether it's for template analysis and I take sort of that matrix, or if it's, more traditional analysis and it's output of coding, but I will send that out to the team who's working on synthesis to sort of digest and think about, and then have everybody come back together to do this process and sort of talk through some of these questions. Some things that I think this matrix and sort of template analysis makes very easy are thinking about commonalities between groups or between participants. Having that matrix right there lets you really easily look across participants and just see sort of in these quick bullets, this is maybe what your 20 people said, and you can start to see where similarities and differences are. you can think about whether there are themes emerging. We talk about themes and thematic analysis a lot. It's not to say that we don't, identify themes within the data, those sort of similar things that are happening. Something I always emphasize in qualitative work is, oftentimes the people who are doing the data collection, who are doing the analysis, especially when we have community embedded researchers, a really good thing to think about, right, is what did you think was interesting? If this is a project you've done and as much as we try not to, right, we come in with sort of preconceptions of what's going on. This is a great time to think about what's interesting. Is there something that we didn't expect to see? The matrix also makes it very easy to count things. There are, obviously differences in opinion about sort of quantifying qualitative data, but, sometimes when you're doing focus groups, for example, it's really helpful to say, the majority of people agreed with this, or the majority of people disagreed with, this concept. And then, you're also going to want to think about how you're going to present the data. Do you need to create textual summaries, figures, or diagrams? This is a time looking at that full matrix to start pulling out representative quotes that you can use. And so I think, I like to emphasize this sort of sixth step of synthesis as being part of the process. Although I will say it's not, when you look sort of at the qualitative method or the rapid qualitative template analysis work, it's often just talking about that steps 1 through 5. I've included here, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this, but it's in the slides that will be sent out as a reference. This is a sort of time commitment table that we put together to help within our institution. We've sent this out to people who are saying, oh, I'd really love to include rapid qualitative analysis in my next project. How can I budget for that? What kind of team do I need to have? And so we've tried to take sort of our estimates of how long this has taken us, so that you can have an idea for yourself. I will say all of these are very dependent on the level of data collection you are doing, the size of your team, and for example, how long. So I have tried to include some guidance on that around, if you have this length of interviews, what it is, about how long per interview, so you can sort of tailor this as needed. So hopefully this is helpful as well. And then last, I just want to spend a minute or two thinking about some of those considerations to get started. I think Patrick and I have both tried to emphasize, as we've been talking about, intro into this project, and sort of I've talked through without some of the, I think, really, always vital in research, but I think very vital in trying to do this research on this rapid timeline, is making a plan for analysis, thinking about things like who's in charge of what, making sure that you have somebody who is keeping you on track, and making sure that all of these steps are followed. Having those periodic meetings for discussion throughout the process. Again, this is partly to keep you on track, and also partly to think about that sort of paper trail audit to have at the end of your project, and really planning for your end product from the beginning. I think that will really inform the level of breadth and depth that you need to get into and include in those templates and in those summaries. Think about who you're trying to communicate to, what you're trying to communicate to. Do you want to have a lot of really good quotes? I will often only have maybe a quote from every couple of interviews when I'm doing those templates, because I just don't find ones that I think that really pop out to me. But maybe you're doing a project that you want to be really quote heavy and be able to present that. So just thinking about, hopefully something you're taking away from this is, I think putting more effort in at the beginning can really get you further at the end in terms of being able to get through this process on a rapid and efficient timeline. And that, I think, is where we are going to break for questions.
Yes, and I do want to mention that we have an exercise planned, but we are also happy to spend as much time answering questions as you would like. The materials to complete the exercise, a blank template, 3 example transcripts, and example matrices are in the shared drive, which we sent out before. We also included the link in the chat. So if we don't have time to get to this exercise, I encourage you to complete it. see how it feels to look at a piece of data and summarize it using these blank templates. We do have some questions in the chat that I've been trying to answer. If you feel like I didn't adequately answer your question, feel free to unmute and ask it. But I will just start with one. Do you calculate inter-rater reliability for rapid qualitative analysis? No, I don't believe so. It doesn't really make sense. And there's no functional way to calculate it. So basically, no. You again, that's why I think documenting the process and really have a firm theoretical and functional understanding of what you're doing is what we rely on for ensuring all of those different measures. Curious if there's an actual timeline template available somewhere. I'm not sure what you mean by timeline template. Could you clarify that? Grace, someone mentioned framework analysis and this sounding familiar to it. I wasn't familiar with framework analysis. Are you?
I am not. If you have more context about that, but was your question whether framework analysis is similar to template analysis?
Yes, the question was, the steps seem similar to framework analysis. How do these two approaches differ?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with framework analysis. If it is, I do know that there's a lot of great resources, especially implementation science that as a field has really taken up rapid qualitative analysis as a method. And there are a lot of papers on how people are using, implementation frameworks as sort of the basis of the domains for methods. I can't speak to whether it's similar, but I am guessing that there's somebody out there who has some work on this.
And last question I'll pull from the chat. Grace, what implementation science framework do you use? I said, I believe you use CFR, but I wasn't sure.
Yes, I use the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CFR, a lot for the work that I do. And there is a great paper on, it's not my paper, it's, I can't remember the author off the top of my head. If I find it, I'll put it in the chat, but that uses CFR with rapid qualitative analysis that I think is a good example of using a theoretical framework with this process.
Hey, anybody want to chime in with a question or not? Up to you. Okay, feel free to put them in the chat if they're going up, but I'm going to get moving, so hopefully we have a little bit of time to do our exercise. So Grace is going to give a brief introduction to her work with this, then I will do the same, and then we'll move on to our exercise.
Great. So what I really wanted to highlight some of the success that we've had in using rapid qualitative methods to facilitate intervention development and implementation. So I am not going to go through like all of our results and sort of process, but instead I just want to sort of give a high level picture of this work that we did. I am at the UMass Chan Prevention Research Center, and we were funded, as I think all of the prevention research centers were across the country, to support COVID-19 vaccine uptake. And our goal was really to support pediatricians in having conversations with vaccine hesitant families. And we were trying to do this on a timeline that sort of matched the vaccine rollout to children and adolescents. If we think back to, early 2021, I think the vaccine first became available to adolescents in the spring, and then we were starting to gear up for, we knew that it would be approved for younger children, ages 5 to 11, sometime in the fall, winter. And so we started in that summer with focus groups and complemented them with interviews. And when we were thinking about, how we wanted to analyze this data, our research questions were really, I don't want to say simple, but I think they were very straightforward. We did focus groups with parents where really our question was, what do you need to know about the vaccine? Who do you want to hear it from? And what would make you feel comfortable vaccinating your child? We're not trying to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of nuances of vaccine hesitancy, which is a very complicated topic. But really just, for those parents, especially who were on the fence about vaccinating, what could we do to help them feel more comfortable? And then similarly with clinicians, some of them were already vaccinating for COVID, some of them were starting to get ready for it. And again, our research questions for them were along the same lines. We really just wanted to hear what's going on, what could we help you with, and what could be improved. And so we were thinking about analyzing these, and that's sort of when we started using rapid analysis. We're like, we don't need to do thematic analysis on these. We're doing these very short 20-30-minute interviews, hour-long focus groups. There's not a need for us to take the time to do a full thematic analysis process. And so I've included our timeline at the bottom, and you can see between July and December, we moved through data collection, and then we're able to do analysis and synthesis between November and January, and move into intervention development in January. And we've done implementation and evaluation by spring of 2022. And so I really credit first the urgency of the need to do this work, but also rapid methods in helping us to get from data collection into implementation and evaluation of an intervention very, very quickly. On the next slide, I've given an example of sort of how we moved from that synthesis to intervention development step. So this is just sort of a screenshot of the synthesis, the template matrix from just one single domain. So this was the domain of resources needed. These were from clinician interviews. And so our team sort of met to look across this domain by interview and start pulling out, these are some things that we could actually act on. And these are some similarities across what participants said. So one theme that really came up was a lot of providers said, we need more patient-facing handouts, we need local materials, we need to have up-to-date information. So we created, these fact sheets that we included as part of our intervention to really respond sort of directly to what we were hearing from them. The things highlighted in yellow, a lot of people said, we need a training. It would be great to know more about logistics. It would be great to have better support in how to counsel parents. And so we, to complement these parent-facing materials, we did a webinar and made some short role-playing videos to be able to respond to these providers' needs. And, I highlighted in red sort of the things that we couldn't do, which were providing additional space or sort of more vaccinators. But hopefully this is just sort of a quick example of how, this is what condensed data in the matrix format looks like. This is, these interviews were probably 20 to 30 minutes. And this was, the level of detail that I included. This resources needed was probably one of the domains that had, that we pulled the most out from, because this was what we were heavily relying on to develop our intervention. So, some people were more verbose about this. But again, hopefully this gives you a little bit of an example of not just what rapid qualitative results look like, but also how we have found it to be, very useful in facilitating intervention development and action. And I'm not going to, go too deep into sort of our lessons learned, because I think Patrick has a lot of the same ones too, and I want to leave time for everything. But what I do really want to highlight is that this was a project where we integrated team members who had pretty much no previous qualitative research experience, and we were able to do that very quickly. And we were able to produce very actionable and publishable results. Our timeline shows how quickly we moved into intervention development, but along the way, we also published 2 peer-reviewed manuscripts from this work. I will say, I don't think I got a single peer review on this questioning like the validity or rigor of rapid methods. So I think that speaks to their growing sort of prominence in the field. But we also used these results, and we had, we did infographics and research briefs, and we were able to, we published these mostly on the same timeline as finishing up our intervention implementation. So again, we have found these to be very useful for quick action-oriented work.
Yeah, so I use these techniques in my work with the emergency food system, and really, I'm a relatively new to Minnesota, and when I came up here, it was right kind of in 2021. A lot was going on in the emergency food system due to the pandemic, and I just wanted to get an idea of the landscape and also use that information to build relationships and establish those community partnerships, and then use that data to influence future research. So we conducted interviews with a really wide variety of partners in the emergency food system. So government, people at food banks, people at different community-based orgs, as well as shoppers between July 2022 and February 2023. Just to give you an idea of what my template looks like, I don't really do the table as Grace mentioned. So here's an example of more the document list style. Again, it's all personal preference. This is what I like. But you can kind of see at the top, there's still the interviewer name, date, who did it, and the characteristics of our participant. And I wanted to show you what our matrix ended up looking like. So each row, again, we had all these domains. I want to highlight, if you look under the first row, challenges getting food, as Grace mentioned, you have to document when people say nothing. So if they say no, you can't just leave this blank, because then your matrix is missing information. To echo some of Grace's lessons learned, I really do think this is easy to integrate team members. My research assistant had no previous qualitative research, picked this right up, and really was able to do a lot of the templating on her own with very little guidance. And having the person who does the data collection also do the summary is really, really helpful, because you're losing some of that understanding and nuance already in the summary process. Having the person who did the interview and can pick up on some of those things is really helpful, because they can include that in their summary. A few of my other lessons learned, I think the execution can be pretty complicated sometimes, specifically with not bringing in information from other interviews when you're trying to get through a lot of this. And, both me and my research assistant were maybe a little bit guilty of this. My research assistant was a little more. So for newer researchers, having that ability to only bring in data from what you're reading it can be challenging. But we also had processes to check our work. So again, and we documented those processes. So we felt very strongly about our results. The other problem I had is I love qualitative data and I like having a lot of detail, but the more detail I put in the summary, the more unwieldy the matrix became. So having smaller, more to the point summaries can be really helpful. I also think group comparisons can be harder than traditional thematic analysis. To me, this might just be how my brain works, so it could work perfectly for you. But when I was trying to compare different groups, the summaries weren't really doing it for me. But when you code the data and then you look at what's coded based on different groups and what they're saying, to me, that can be much easier. The best thing I liked about these results was that member checking, where you share your results with your participants to kind of confirm what they said, was much easier. Rather than sharing a list of themes with some example quotes, we actually got to say, here's a summary of what we talked about. Did we miss anything? Is there anything else you'd like to add? And they really understood it, and we had great response to our member checking process, which, I don't know I've always had with more thematic analysis. Just to do some broad wrap-ups, and then we'll have another opportunity for questions. we really think that this technique and all rapid methods are really useful in distilling broad perspectives, generating ideas, and answering some of those preliminary questions. And we love that it leads to action-oriented research. It really facilitates that, and we all want our research to have an impact in the communities or in practice. I do, think we need to be careful and make sure if we're answering questions that require nuance and deep understanding to use the appropriate techniques, not just get caught up in that this is faster, this is cheaper, we can go to action. If your question requires, use those traditional techniques that we're all familiar with, or find somebody who does. So as we get to that, we have another opportunity for questions, thoughts, or comments, or we're happy to answer those. I believe we have about 14 minutes or 10 minutes left in this session. So we can spend that answering questions, or we can try to get in the exercise. I think it's a little bit of a short timeline.
Yeah, I would say that's probably not quite enough time, right, Patrick? I saw a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to answer a little more thoroughly. Somebody just asked about using transcripts versus straight interview recordings. I have done both. I find, just to expand on what I said in the chat, for short interviews, I've been doing a lot of like 10, 15-minute sort of quick interviews with people recently. And for those, I haven't been getting full transcripts. One feature that our team has used is to use the closed caption feature on Zoom to sort of record a transcript of an interview. And then have a team member go back and clean that up a little bit. Zoom doesn't produce perfect transcripts, but if you have just done the interview and then you sort of go back and listen to it quickly, you can usually clean it up to a point where it's almost like notes that you can then use for creating your summary template. I think this is a great way, if you're trying to save money and time by using a professional transcriptionist. I find it very unwieldy for focus group data and for interviews that are a little bit longer though. So just sort of my 2 cents on that, because there are a lot of people who do rapid analysis who do not use transcripts at all to do their work. And so that is a totally valid way of doing this.
I also think if you're working with people who have less experience with qualitative work, it helps to have a transcript. It's easier to grasp and handle. If you're more experienced with qualitative research, yes, I think you don't necessarily need it. But yes, I agree with what Grace said in terms of whether you need transcripts. So it seems like we've gotten a lot of kind of what are appropriate research questions for this method. And that's kind of hard to answer because there's a lot of nuance that goes into that. So like, a research question is generally pretty broad. What happened in the emergency food system as the pandemic progressed? So I answered that research question using these methods. But again, it was a preliminary understanding. And really, our goal is to go back and do maybe some more traditional analysis to capture that nuance. So again, we use this technique because I wanted to work with my community partners and say, here's what's happened. Here are some of those big emerging problems that we might need to tackle in an intervention study. So, I think really the key thing is thinking that we can answer this deductively. We're not trying to do an inductive analysis. These techniques really aren't appropriate for that. And is the goal a preliminary understanding? So by that, I really just mean not nuanced, not necessarily a ton of detail. But that doesn't mean it's not important. You can answer incredibly important questions with a yes or no. Did older adults continue receiving food from this provider over the pandemic? Yes. Perfect. We're glad we know that. We also can answer more nuanced questions about that. Grace, any other thoughts on how you'd think about appropriate research questions for this method?
Yeah, I think evaluation of interventions, evaluation of programs are very well suited for rapid analysis. So if you have a question around what was the process of how this program worked, or how successful was this program, and you want to answer that qualitatively, your interview guide or focus group guide probably looks something like, what were the barriers? What made this work well? I think those kinds of overarching research questions and specific interview guide questions are great for this. I think, like Patrick said, some of it depends on the goals of your project, but trying questions around understanding process of how something happened, understanding, people's maybe like our work on vaccination. We were not trying to develop a new model of vaccine hesitancy for COVID-19, but we were trying to understand what people thought, where people sought information, and what were, again, those barriers, facilitators questions. So I think these, like I said, these sort of process type questions are great for this. Those questions where you're trying to understand a bigger sort of phenomenon and really describe it in full are going to be a little bit harder to answer with this kind of thing.
Yes, and so Ashley just asked, do you feel, is there a cutoff in terms of how much time you spend per transcript so you don't go down the rabbit hole? I also tend to get lost and want to dig in very deep. This is something you pick up at that step 3. If you feel like you're really diving deep, it could be because of your template not being really designed well. It could also, again, are you trying to answer questions that aren't well suited to this method? So if you're spending 3 hours on a 30-minute interview, that something's wrong. Grace did one of the slides includes general time commitments. I think if you're going kind of more than 3 times the length of the data collection, revise your template. Think about the goals of your project. Figure out why. Is it just like I'm giving too much detail and we don't need that much detail? So it really isn't that step 3 where you figure those things out.
I agree. I also think if you feel like you're spending a lot of time, that might be a sign that you can do rapid qualitative analysis, but then you also want to follow up and do a more traditional thematic analysis or whatever you think is appropriate. Patrick highlighted in the beginning, doing rapid analysis does not preclude other types of analysis. I will say I've never done that. I think Patrick and I were talking when we were preparing for this. I feel like I am sitting on sort of a trove of qualitative data that I've analyzed rapidly, and there are a couple of projects that I have in mind where I could go back and do that deeper dive. I also think it's a little bit of practice too, right? It's a little bit of, once you do the template summary for 1 or 2 and you sort of get that in your head and you get the consistency between you and your team members of how much you want to include, you can go through the rest of that a little bit faster. I probably always spend the most time on the first transcript too, especially if I'm not as familiar with the work. And I thought Ashley had a follow-up question. Better, what amount of transcripts, better for small projects with 10 or big with 20, 50? I think, I don't think that there's a number of transcripts that this works well for. I think this would work great for a project with 50 transcripts because you'd get through it a lot faster than trying to code 50 transcripts. So I wouldn't worry too much about the number. I think, like everything, it's going to depend on how big your team is and how you're going to be able to get through that. But I think rapid analysis is great for large interview or large focus group projects.
Yeah, I agree. A previous comment mentioned that a lot of times in evaluation, you do very similar things, but you don't actually have a name. And yeah, when you have those large evaluation qualitative data sets where you're talking to 100 people, you have to do something like this. So it's not really the number. Again, it's all about those questions. Liana asks, is there anything you look for in a first transcript? Not really. I mean, I tend to do if the first interview I do was good, I'm not treating it as a pilot interview. I'll use that one. Just kind of use the one after that. And again, it's always an iterative process. You're never necessarily done. You can be done, but you're always thinking about, do we need to change things based on what data is coming in? So before we do wrap up and give one more thing, I want to mention that we prepared an exercise. I'm fine spending so much more time going over the steps because that's more important. And these resources are available to you. So in this Google Drive, there's really short examples, transcripts that are about 2 pages. And you can take those and the example blank template and try to summarize. Just try it out in this really low stakes, low risk context. Again, those are available in the resource folder. And if you have any questions, you can always, feel free to email me, or I'm sure Grace is happy to be emailed. And we can walk through, how to prepare and think about using this in your own work. So unless there's any remaining questions, I think we're approaching the end of the session. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
We have until 1, so we have roughly 3 minutes.
Okay. Well, we will hang around for those 3 minutes. If people have questions, feel free to stick around and chat. We really appreciate you coming. We do think these techniques are really important for public health practice and getting more people involved in qualitative research.